Well, let's talk a little bit more about what next for Eskom as a company. Now, Eskom's situation is a result of years of mismanagement, poor prioritizing of investments in the firm. This, of course, is according to a government probe that took place. President Ramaphosa has now appointed a new team to manage the utility and certainly turn it around. Now, earlier on, I spoke to Ted Blom, who's a mining and energy expert, as well as Dr. Mthanti, who's a senior lecturer at Wits Business School, to break down the issues behind Eskom and what is the way forward.
The money that the government advanced was under the emergency funding requirements. So you can only press that button if it's an emergency. So for the minister now to say it wasn't an emergency means that somebody's lied to the fiscus. And I don't believe that that is appropriate. So to the extent that it is emergency funding, it means that Eskom is in a very precarious situation. And in fact, I forecast earlier on in the year that by the end of March, Eskom will have its back to the wall and needs to go into business rescue. If I may just briefly say, I think that the CRO, the Chief Reorganization Officer that they've now appointed, which is a new term, I think is nothing other than a business rescue practitioner in disguise.
And of course, it's been about 26 days of load shedding. But what we hear is more recently, the situation seems to have been improved. South Africans are seeing power. So what do you think is behind that seeming sort of restoration in power in South Africa?
In my view, what you are seeing at Eskom is a financial crisis mutating into an operational crisis because Eskom is not properly funded. The operations are no longer being properly run. They're losing quite a bit of money, and obviously they've got a pretty high cash burn rate. I think they're burning through about 6 billion odd. And with the resolution of the power crisis, hopefully they're not just burning more money through buying more diesel. And I think the government so far, in fact for the last 10 years, since Eskom started its build program, they've been drip feeding it with funds. They've never really actually properly funded it. And it's just created a massive, massive problem. Together with the corruption and the inefficiencies, it's created a massive, massive problem.
Right. Well, looking at this situation, how do you feel then about the outlook for Eskom, financially especially? Now, ratings companies, they say that one of the biggest risks to the country going forward is helping Eskom pay off this debt. At the same time, experts are also saying that Eskom, it doesn't expect to be able to generate enough internal cash in order to meet its obligations in the next 5 years. How does that make you feel about the outlook of the company?
My take is very simple, that if Eskom is cleaned up, as the good doctor has just indicated it needs to do, and which the board has promised by September last year that they would have a turnaround plan, if they clean it up on the coal side, it will save them 40 billion a year. On the human resources side, it will save them roughly 31 billion a year. On the corrupt IPP process, it will save them roughly 34 billion this year, 50 billion next year, and 80 billion in year 3. If that is sorted out, then Eskom has got more than 100 billion rand a year in free cash flow. If the debt that's standing at 400 and I think closer to 500 billion than 419, because they've now borrowed 3 tranches or 4 tranches of extra cash. But if that is halved, because that's the extent to which the assets have been overvalued, if that is halved, then you can repay that debt within 3 to 4 years, which is an exceptionally short time for long-term assets. Eskom has not got a financial problem. Eskom's got a management problem. That's the
And do you agree with that it's more management than it is financial?
I doubt whether it's financial or management. I think it's much deeper. I think the problems with Eskom are not really rocket science. You've got a bunch of political interests that wants to, in a way, privatize the money for themselves from Eskom. So a lot of the political interests are hugely conflicted. A lot of the senior management is hugely conflicted. Eskom signs some of the most ridiculous agreements anybody would sign. They buy coal from double or 3 times the price from one mine compared to another. They pay for IPP power at 3 or 4 or 5 times the going rate. Political interests are involved in that. It's literally being looted, and the scale of it, contrary to what people expected, the scale of the private interests and them trying to defend their turf with the change in government from Zuma to Ramaphosa has just seemingly increased. and more of the decisions are increasingly irrational.
Well, then I am curious then what your thoughts are on the government's turnaround strategy for Eskom in 2019. There's a new management team that was put in place, and of course they mentioned possibly splitting the entity into 3 different parts. What are your thoughts on those ideas they have, and what are the possible solutions you both feel that they should be employing going forward?
Okay, if I may go first. Well, firstly, they haven't tabled the turnaround plan. They've put through a muddled unbundling strategy, which I have not seen, and I don't know if anybody has seen a document quantifying the effect and the impact of that. You can't unbundle $1 billion entity and not have a strategy document with milestones and yardsticks and tick boxes and stuff. I mean, what's going on here? So the government had initially the board that was supposed to do the turnaround. They delivered nothing. 12 months or 14 months later, they haven't delivered anything. Then they appointed the 8 wise men, okay, of which 2 resigned. And they came up with the unbundling strategy over Christmas. But there's nothing to prove it, or no numbers to support what they say.
And Doctor, are you as skeptical?
Yeah, maybe perhaps more so, not so much on the operational side, but on the actual strategic and more political side, which obviously has a huge impact on the financial bearing. I think largely the decisions, number one, to sign IPP contracts, the round 4 ones, they were very questionable. Number 2, the decision to unbundle Eskom itself is very questionable. It seems mainly structured to serve IPP interests, right? So that they can sign directly with the systems operator, right? And you leave Eskom generation out, perhaps it becomes, as they call it, a bad bank to shut it down or to reduce it. Now, if I'm a creditor, I'd want to know where will my debt sit? Will it sit with generation? Will it sit with transmission? Will it sit with the systems operator? And if that one is a bad asset, what happens to my debt? My view is it seems the major overriding imperative of decisions over the last 18 months or so has been to protect IPP interests, not to protect the country, not to save Eskom, not to ensure reliable supply for the country, but to protect IPP interests. And unfortunately, politicians from the president down are conflicted. They have investments and interest in IPPs. And decisions at Eskom purely seem to be based on protecting their interests.